Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 135. Today, I'm speaking again with nature journal educator Marley Peifer. Marley is well known in the nature journal community and has always been really committed to nature journaling as a tool for learning and a tool essentially for saving the world through nature connection. This time when we spoke, Marley talked about a whole lot of questions that have been coming up for him that have made him wonder whether we need to shift direction and move towards a different way of connecting with nature, not only with a rational mind, but with a more sensory, embodied, spiritual way of relating too. If you follow Marley and you know his work, I think this conversation is going to be really interesting for you. Before we jump into it, I want to say thank you to those people who support this podcast on Patreon. Patreon is a platform that gives folks the ability to support the show by pledging a monthly donation, which can be as little as $1 per month. Thank you to those who have recently joined us there and those who have rejoined recently too. As part of the Patreon community, I've started posting my upcoming guests on the platform and giving patrons a chance to ask questions which I will then ask directly to my guests during interviews. If you'd like to have a chance to directly ask questions of the podcast guests, I would love to have you as a patron of the show. Every bit of support is deeply appreciated and it helps keep this show sustainable. So I'm really interested to share today's interview with you because it was one that was actually very unexpected. Marley has always been set on and very vocal about nature journaling being a revolutionary activity that's going to save the world. And I went into this conversation thinking that we would talk along those lines. But when we started talking, it was clear that a lot of questions have been coming up for Marley and that he has a sense that we need to go deeper or change tack if we're going to make change inside ourselves and externally in the world. I think questioning our assumptions is always an important step in moving towards living in better relationship with ourselves and with each other and with the world. There are a lot of insights in what Marley has to say today. Let's listen. Marley, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Yay, I'm glad to be here.
It seems to me like since we spoke last time, you've made some dramatic changes to your life. In the last year or so, you've been traveling, living in your car, teaching in the Galapagos. Right now, as we speak, you're in a cloud forest in Ecuador. Tell me what's going on.
Yeah, well, I'm in a cloud forest in Ecuador, in the town of Mindo, and the reason why I'm here is actually because there is going to be a massive birding festival next week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's a South American birding festival, and my goal is to grow nature journaling in South America, and birding communities were one of the early adopters of nature journaling in North America and in Europe, I believe, as well, and probably in Australia, I'm not sure. And so I, as part of my plan, thought that infiltrating the South American birding community and spreading nature journaling was a good idea.
That's amazing. So you speak fluent Spanish, right? Do you do all your outreach in South America in Spanish?
Yeah, I do. I don't speak Portuguese, so I have to focus on the Spanish-speaking parts of South America.
How did you come to be fluent in Spanish?
Well, luckily, my parents traveled with us when I was young in Spanish-speaking countries. I also studied quite a few years in school, even though studying doesn't necessarily lead to fluency, as I learned from studying 3 semesters of French, I think. So the immersion really helps, and I've kept it up. And I also like to read and listen to audiobooks. And I read the entire Harry Potter series in Spanish, and I listen to audiobooks in Spanish as well.
Wow. And I
Yeah.
love that it seems like all these changes, it seems to me like you have just thrown yourself, your whole life into this kind of outreach, this idea of spreading nature journaling to new places, new people. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I've been actually questioning a lot of aspects of it more recently, and there's definitely been ups and downs, and I think as you're probably aware, when we work in this sort of realm of social media and having a persona of sorts that we present, it can become confusing sometimes what you're actually doing, who you actually are, and what you actually want. And I think it can also be confusing what are the reasons why you're doing things in the first place. And so I've definitely, especially recently, had quite a few more questions around it, but definitely going into it at the beginning, I think I've been teaching nature journaling and trying to be a nature journaling professional full time for a little over 2 years at this point. And I wasn't traveling or living nomadically for that entire time, but I was trying to create content and use my Patreon and use my YouTube as my main sources of income, as well as like teaching classes on Zoom, but just focusing completely on nature journaling. And so I think I did 1 year, about one full year living in California and trying to teach nature journaling full time and be a nature journaler full time. And then now I think I have a year and a half of living nomadically basically and trying to teach and nature journal full time. And what I've learned is that it is possible to live in countries that are cheaper than California, for example, and try to do all of the income online, but it's not easy. And I definitely have gone through major periods of self-doubt, like
Mm.
cycles of doubt about it. And I don't it's really easy to think like, oh, I'm not doing well, or I'm doing something wrong, or I'm not good enough. And then it's also easy to think like, oh, maybe it's because nature journaling is too niche, because I've seen other YouTubes and Instagrams and other Patreons, for example, grow in the same amount of time that I've been working on these platforms, grow much faster than mine has. And I think it's just, as an adult human being, it can just be really hard to find yourself in that place and to try to continue to just keep at it and keep believing in it and not just constantly question the whole thing, because I've definitely been struggling financially pretty much the whole time. And so it's hard to keep convincing yourself that it's the right thing to do, or that it makes sense, or you're doing a good job.
Yes, and I have the exact same feelings and questions, and do I throw it in? Do I do something else? Do I whatever those thoughts are? And I don't have the answer. In fact, I as part of this new interview process, I've started gathering questions from patrons of the show, listeners who support the show on Patreon. One of the sort of fun things I wanted to start up is to get patrons to start asking questions of my guests. And you were the first one, and I have some questions which you have had a little sneak
Yay.
peek at. But one of the questions is from Kim, who is also a nature journal educator in Australia. And Kim wants to know, what's your advice for other nature journaling teachers? And sometimes I think when we get a question like this, it's like because people maybe feel like you've got it all figured out, and maybe it's not like that. But I wonder if you do have advice for other educators and what that might be.
I think my first thought would be to be very careful about this modern world of content creator and digital entrepreneur world that we live in. I think there is a lot of very confusing information out there. I think there's a lot of different voices with different agendas. I think it's really easy to lose sight of what you're actually doing it for and what is actually realistic. I also had some insights from recently reading this book called The Black Swan.
Mm-hmm.
In that book, he talks about these two places, imaginary places. One is Mediocristan and one is Extremistan. And so these are just concepts, but basically, if you sell cookies at a bakery in a specific town, that business is in Mediocristan. There's only so many cookies you can make in a day. There's like these physical limits on how much you can produce, and there's very like clear limits on how many consumers you can have, how many people you can sell to, and how that business works. How many cookie shops can there be in a town? All of those things operate within sort of a level of numbers that are easy for the human mind to grasp. However, when you go to selling books, for example, or podcasts or videos or TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, you're in a completely different realm that he calls Extremistan. And in there, it's not like these things are numbers and orders of magnitude that the human brain cannot even wrap its head around. And it could be like the difference between you and another content creator could be like these orders of magnitude that our brain doesn't even understand. There's also all of these effects in that type of a world that are very hard to understand. And some of them, for example, don't clearly equate to like put in this amount of effort and you'll receive this result.
Yes.
So like if you're a baker and you put in a certain amount of effort, you're in a certain town, there's only like 2 other, 3 other, 5 other bakers you're competing with. It's like the things that can possibly happen are much more like within your control and even within your realm of understanding and predictability. When you're on YouTube, it's not like that at all. It's like a completely different planet. It's Extremistan, as he would call it. I don't like those names that much, but they can be useful. And the effects are extreme. So even like a little random thing, like for example, or maybe not so random, like what your face looks like, or what your voice sounds like, or what is popular in like 1 month out of the entire year. Those teeny little random weird things that you don't have control over can have this huge impact on how you perform in the Extremistan world. And I think that helped me a little bit just kind of put into perspective and just think about it, because it's really easy to be on these platforms and like compare yourself to other people, or listen to all these gurus and motivational entrepreneurs talking about how blah blah blah, do this, do that, just make your Instagram reels like this. You know, I've wasted thousands of hours of my life probably creating content on some of these platforms trying to figure it out. And if I actually calculated how much time I've spent and how much money I've made, it would be really hard to justify that. So I think that's one thing. And then finally, it's like you have to have self-awareness and have a reason for what you're doing. And I think at a certain point, it's like if your reason is just like this is a business and I'm just trying to do it as a business, that could be really hard, and you probably shouldn't do it around nature journaling. You should probably do something around fitness or ice baths or like makeup or something that is proven to be more profitable, because I don't think that it's very easy to make money teaching nature journaling online. If you stay in Mediocristan, like teaching in person nature journaling things in your specific community, I think that, or like, maybe you find a niche like teaching nature journaling to teenagers of like homeschool families. That is in Mediocristan, and I think that might be a more sane approach, and something where you might have a better ability to see the results of your efforts in a way that's not just constantly driving you crazy like online.
It's almost as if it's this ironic thing that what we are trying to do as nature journal educators is to get people outside, to get them away from the screen, to get them to be focused on the real world and the present moment. And yet to do that, we have to flip it over and spend time on the screen and be thinking about this and the future and blah, blah, blah. And so it's almost like this terrible trade-off that has to be made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I've been thinking about that a lot more as well. And I think, for a while I was just really gung-ho and really just working really hard and just really believing like, okay, if I keep doing this, it's going to work. And recently I have been questioning that and thinking, you know, is putting 12 hours on the computer a day, like, um is that really going to be more impactful than me actually just starting with myself and making sure that I have a connection with nature and that I cultivate my personal connection with nature, and starting there. Because yeah, I think exactly like you're saying, there's an irony to it, and there's also a hollowness to it. If you're proposing or um, pushing something that you're not actually able to do for yourself, there's something wrong with that.
I feel like there's a cohort, like nature journaling has exploded in the last few years, especially since the pandemic, and there is like this cohort of nature journal teachers coming through, people who have recognized this is a beautiful, beautiful practice that can help me, and I'd love to share that practice with the world. And to access the world, you have to do it through the screen. And so there's this sort of cohort of us walking through the process and trying to figure it out. And I think Kim, who asked this question, is in that same situation of just like, we don't know how to do it, how to make it sustainable, how to make it practically doable in a week, and how to get by financially and all that stuff. I think we're all sort of figuring it out at the same time.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer, and I don't know that anyone does, but I guess we'll watch it unfold.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the direction I'm leaning in more and more, and we'll see what happens, but like, I think that there needs to be a bigger shift. There needs to be something deeper that we're doing. And I've been having a lot of questions about like just how, because I've always thought like, oh, nature journaling is so revolutionary. Nature journaling, this is the paradigm shift that we need. And this is a way that we can actually change and save the world. But I think that there's something so insidious and something so pervasive and also transparent in a way about the system that we are enmeshed in, that it's so easy for everything that we're doing to just be sort of co-opted by this bigger sort of late stage capitalism weirdness that we live in. And no matter how beautiful and revolutionary something seems, it's really easy for it to just be doing more of the same. And I'm afraid that a lot of what I thought was so world changing is actually just another thing, another trend, another niche in this just big cycle of consumption and production that is not actually shifting the basic level in which humans live and humans relate to themselves, to other humans, and to the natural environment. And I think that what we're going to actually need is something a lot deeper and something that needs to somehow like break out of this system that we're stuck in.
Mm, mm. Your thoughts are leading me to my next question, which is that you are obviously a deep thinker, someone who spends time thinking about the human mind, about metacognition, about the human condition and philosophical teachings and things like that. And this question comes from Karina, and she's interested in how you integrate reading and learning about these big picture philosophical things. You're obviously a reader. How do you integrate these concepts and learning about these concepts into your nature journaling practice and into your life?
I think we don't always know how we're integrating ideas. I tend to pursue the approach of exposing myself to a lot of things, and sometimes I do focused intentional combination or reflection or synthesis, but I also try to just expose myself to sometimes intentionally very different things at the same time, and then see what the synthesis is that comes accidentally, or while I'm sleeping, stuff is being recombined in new ways. And I think that intentionally seeking out very different teachers, for example, is a great practice. So for example, I will sometimes go through a phase where I go to the library and I just get some really different stuff. So like I'll get books about comics, like Calvin and Hobbes, for example. I'll get like an Albrecht Dürer book with his woodblock carvings from, I don't know if that was the 1600s in Western Europe, and just get like a weird combination of things. And some of it's just visual, right? So I'll look through art books. I probably shouldn't be giving away these kind of secrets, but I'll just get like a huge stack of art books from the library of really random stuff. And I'll just look through things like that before going to sleep. Or I'll, listen to audiobooks and read books that are just all over, sort of all over the place and from different perspectives, and then just see what synthesis comes from that. I think that as far as philosophy goes, it's really important to look at how it actually applies to our daily life. And I think if it's not directed towards living better and in better relationship to other people and nature, then it's not very useful. And one of the things that I also think, obviously, is that thinking in questions is often um, the best approach anyways. And one of the questions that I've been having a lot lately is whether nature journaling is, and this is something that I've wondered about before from a variety of different perspectives, but recently what I've been wondering is how much somatic experience and relationship is missing from nature journaling. And I think that if you look at the history of our species, for over 90% of our existence on this planet, our relationship with nature was not about observation. Like we use this word observation a lot, and you could say that yes, like hunter gatherers have like good observation and stuff like that, but actually it's probably, what observation is probably not really a great description for that. It is like they are part of nature. They're eating and killing other animals. They're being killed and being eaten by other animals. And we think that we're not like that today. We are still like that today. Every moment that I'm alive, things are dying so that I can be alive, and parts of me are dying, and I will die. And we think we're so separate from that, and we've mentally separated ourselves from that. And I'm a little bit worried more and more that nature journaling doesn't always provide a good way for us to remember how we are related to nature in the way that we did for 90% of our existence on this planet. And on a cellular level, your body knows that relationship with nature. And I think that nature journaling is a little bit removed from that. And I think there's approaches and tweaks to the nature journaling that you can do, or directions it could go in that could bring in more of that. But for the most part, I'm starting to worry more recently that we're not addressing that aspect of it. And I think that in some ways, that somatic body felt relationship with nature in like a physical way, like more senses, more physicality, more touching, more relation, like direct relating with nature is necessary to actually save the planet, save our species, save as many species as we can, or actually do anything. Because in some ways, the nature journaling and a lot of nature journaling that we do, it's kind of superficial. And I think that there's a lot deeper that we could go, or we need to incorporate some other practices to complement our nature journaling, because nature journaling by itself might not be like, if nature journaling is the only way you relate to nature, that might not be enough. There might need to be, you might need to go fishing, or you might need to learn how to build your own structures out of wood, or you might need to heat your home with firewood and learn what it's like to cut down trees, burn those trees to heat your house, and have some other types of ways that you relate to nature besides just nature journaling. And I think that and this is going to be something that I'm going to, differ from a lot of people on and probably receive a lot of criticism from. But I think that we're very focused on comfort and like being nice and being accepting of everybody. And I think those are really important things. Those come from liberal humanism. And liberal humanism is basically the main religion or philosophy on the planet right now. And most people don't even know what it means, but that is basically like the foundation of almost all of our beliefs and thoughts of most people on the planet today. And it's where, human rights, the concept of human rights comes from, and all of that. And that's really great. And I think that, in the nature journaling community, there's a huge focus on acceptance and kindness and all of that. And I think those are really important. However, I do think that sometimes with that, we get into this place that's very focused about us, and it's very focused about the individual and the needs of the individual. And I actually think when it comes down to it, if you look at nature, the individual is not the most important thing in nature. And when you look at human happiness, humans become happy not when their individual needs are met, not when they're the most comfortable. And oftentimes when we're destroying the planet right now trying to make individuals comfortable, and then they're unhappy. And then you look at the parts of the world where people have the most comfort and the most resources, and they're not the most happy. So I think that there needs to be I think we might need to have some philosophical shifts at some point that address some of these like deeper questions. And I do think that our nature journaling might need to start addressing some topics that people are currently uncomfortable with. So for example, if our nature journals are to help us, I think we might need to use them more to address things that people might currently be uncomfortable with, or things that might make you sad. For example, extinction. we are living in the sixth great extinction. There are more species going, there's as many species going extinct right now as there has been, like, during the time when like all the dinosaurs went extinct and all these major extinction events. And so it's like just 2 days ago, 21 species, I think it was 21 species were removed from the endangered species list in the United States of America because they're extinct
Oh,
the day
gosh.
before yesterday. They were removed from the endangered species list because they went extinct. And it's like, how many of those, if you went on the Nature Journal Club Facebook page right now, how many posts would you see about any of those species? Probably zero. And so that to me is unacceptable because no one nature journaled the dodo. And it's a shame because the images we have of the dodo are terrible. They're all based on very they're not very, no one wrote down good descriptions. We don't know what it sounded like. We don't know what it looked like. There aren't any good drawings of it that were done from firsthand observation. And that's a shame. And we shouldn't let that happen with these other ones that are going extinct. And so it's like things like that, or things like what we're eating, for example, or ecosystems, collapsing around us. Those are all hard things to talk about, and if you bring it up in a forum with a group of people, so it'll bring up trauma or things like that. Some people won't want to talk about it. So these are tricky things, and I think that it's only going to get more like that. And what my biggest fear is that nature journaling is just another form of escapism, and that nature journaling is just something that affluent people do to make themselves feel better about like their relationship to nature and their creativity, and they get their little dopamine rush from creativity and nature, and then that's the end of the thing. And that, like, there's people in Bangladesh whose ecosystem is collapsing, and it's like, can nature journaling work for them? That's what I want to see. Can nature journaling work in these mega biodiverse countries where people are actually like still directly hand to mouth connected to nature? We're so disconnected from nature in a lot of parts of the world that like our nature journals is just, it's kind of abstract. And so philosophically, those are my questions that I have philosophically right now, is like, can nature journaling actually do these things that we all have been saying it can do?
Wow. Okay. There's so many things in there. It sounds like you're saying that we can use a nature journal as an observer to observe nature, these things that are happening to us. Okay, we'll write down what we see, what we notice. But that doesn't necessarily lead into a deep connection on an embodied level. And embodying that connection with nature
Mhm.
is something that's really important. Does that sound kind of...
Yeah, I'm so glad that you used that term because I didn't use that one, but I think that's probably actually the best, is how embodied is nature journaling, or how disembodied is nature journaling. And if it's not possible to make it more embodied, then how can we have ancillary practices, or how can we make sure that we're still doing some of those other things? Because I think some of those embodied ways of connecting with nature are going to be essential for us to move forward and get people to actually care, and to heal our bodies, because we're we're facing all these physical, like truly physiological consequences of being disconnected from our embodied relationship to nature.
And I think what you're saying also is that, we have there are places where people have a lot of privilege, and if you have a lot of privilege, generally you're... I'm thinking now of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Your needs at the base
Mm-hmm.
of the pyramid are being met. You're safe, you're comfortable, you have food, you have da da da. And sitting at the top
Mm.
can be like someone who has enough free time, enough energy, enough whatever it is to then be creative. And sometimes you look at the world, look at the news, and the world is just falling apart in places. And um, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Like, what is this? Is it just something for people who sit at the top of the
Hmm.
pyramid, the hierarchy of needs, people who have everything covered before you can do this? Or is it something that can functionally help you in a crisis or in other situations?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Oh, wow. Okay. I feel like I'm having a crisis now.
I know.
Shake
Let's
it off.
shake that off a little bit. Yeah.
One thing I
Woo.
wanted to talk to you, and this sort of flips that over because we were being very serious, but recently you
Hmm.
posted about creativity and play. And I really strongly believe that creativity and play are synonymous, and that you can't have creativity without play. And we can get so caught up in the seriousness of all this, of art and whatever we want to create something. um I'd love to hear you talk about play in your life and in your nature journal.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because as a nature journal educator, one of the main things that I've seen when trying to help other people is that the problem is not like teaching people technical aspects of how to use watercolor. The problem is not how do you hold the pencil the correct way, or how what are the steps to draw the shape of an animal correctly. The problems are all these weird psychological wounds that
Yes.
people carry from childhood basically. And we've got procrastination, perfectionism, self-judgment. I think for a Wild Wonder class, like 3 years ago, I taught a class on mindset. And after, like months of thinking about it, I like brainstormed all of these problems and I had this massive list of all of these mental things that get in the way. So the crazy part is that if you draw every day, the technical things usually will get better on their own.
Mm.
Like if you just draw every single day, your drawings will, based on observation, right? Based on like observing animals or plants in the real world, your drawings will get better. But the crazy part is those mental obstacles do not. And so like you can find artists who have been, perfecting their craft for decades and decades, and they can still be crippled completely by these mental obstacles,
Yes.
completely stopped in their tracks, completely frozen, or completely stop or quit what they're doing. And so I realized early on I need to be addressing these, um, even more important than addressing the, like, how to mix watercolor.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I found, and it almost ruined, I sort of burnt out last month. And then I've also gone through some phases of like, I thought I was unstoppable. My nature journaling was just like, I was just filling pages like crazy. But then I think one of the things that I realized has been missing is playfulness. And
Mm.
so I've been trying to do a lot more doodling. So I've also been trying to draw more from imagination because I think when I was a kid, I would draw from imagination. And it's easy at a certain point, like when you're learning nature journaling or you're learning drawing from life, suddenly you realize the power of drawing from observation and practicing drawing from real life. And then you get to a point where you can't draw without a reference.
Yes.
And it's really easy to get to that point. And it's like suddenly you can't draw from imagination at all. And so I've been trying to practice drawing from imagination. I even have like a page at the beginning of my one of my nature journals right now, where I just doodle and draw random stuff. Let me see if I can find it here. And yeah, so like I'm just filling space with
Nice.
all kinds of completely random weird stuff. And I think that it's actually super important and super helpful, or like even just warm-ups, um, drawing weird stuff. Like, I think a lot of adults who are in nature journaling or into any type of drawing that's based on nature, plants, and animals, they might lose their ability to draw imaginary stuff. And I think being able to imagine things is actually really important, even if your only goal is really to nature journal and draw stuff from life, that being able to draw from your imagination is actually going to help fill in some of the gaps. And it's a playful type of drawing, and just at least trying to remind your brain that drawing is fun too, and making it fun um, can help just loosen up a little bit and not get stuck.
I 100% agree. I think we can take it entirely too seriously. I do love in all your work, there's a humor that comes through. And I don't know if that's just your personality coming out or if it's a teaching tactic. I wonder about if you feel that humor can help people learn or whether this is just you being playful and silly.
Yeah, I don't think I'm that funny actually, unfortunately.
But you are.
Um,
Everybody loves your. You just bring a silliness to it, and maybe it's not like a can stand up comedian funny, but you definitely bring a
mhm.
levity and a humor in just your playfulness and in general in your videos.
Yeah, I think that it does play a role in learning, and it plays a role in memory. And I also think, so like here's a page that I did today, and I have, a little cartoon of myself, and it says surprise, and my eyebrows are like flying
Yes.
off of my head. And so I think that doing a little bit of comics and doing a little bit of humor and incorporating yourself onto the page is super important. And I think probably other people are having that experience too. It's just we might not give ourselves permission to put it on the page
Yes.
because it's Arches. This is Arches fancy watercolor paper, and I have like a some like fancy orchid that I just drew. I'm not gonna put like a cartoon of my face like with my
Yes.
tongue hanging out like next to that watercolor orchid.
Yes, yes. The choice of materials. I do love Arches paper when I'm painting something that is watercolor, but never in my journals. In my journals, it's all just whatever as it comes. It there's definitely
Yeah.
a when you've got a $7 piece of paper, there's definitely a nervousness that creeps in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I had to work with arches a little bit last month, and it was like, wow, okay, this is fancy.
Well, it does behave differently, and I feel like you
Hmm.
can do a whole range of different watercolor techniques with paper like that you can't on other paper. But again, we're going back to like, what's it all about? Do we want to make art, or do we want to embody that nature connection?
That okay, this is another thing that I think is not going to be super popular, and I could post a question about it on the Facebook page, but then there'd probably be like too much vitriol, and then the moderators would get angry with me because I wouldn't check on it like 5 times a day to make sure people weren't insulting each other. But like spirituality, I know we have a lot of like very Christian people who got into nature journaling, for whatever reason. And I talked on one interview. I think I did talk with someone about who is Christian about it. Timothy Joe, in fact, I think was the one that I talked to about it. But other than that, there's not really discussions about that. And I think like that is another piece that we need to bring in. And it might just be the phase that I'm in my life right now, and the influences and stuff I've been reading and listening to. But like if you look at a couple people on the Nature Journal show, when I asked the question, if you could nature journal with anyone in history, who would you nature journal with? Several people have said the people who painted on the caves in Lascaux and
Mm,
these different, some of these ancient works of art. There's great ones in Australia as well. But
yes.
like, what were those people doing, when they're drawing those animals? Like, what were they doing? Because if you think about it, that's what our brain and our body was doing for 90% of the time or more that we've been here as a species. So that is way more who we are than this. So it's like, what were they trying to do? What was the meaning of that art? Can we incorporate some elements of that or think about that when we're nature journaling? Like, is like, where is the animacy, like of what we're doing? Like, what is the like magic of what we're doing? Are like, what are we calling into being when we put these marks on paper? Um, I think there's a lot of potential in that area to look into. And to tell you the truth, I actually think that if we're going to save things on this planet, there needs to be a spiritual element to it, because spirituality, ritual, accessing, other levels of consciousness besides just like individual rational consumer, that is going to be necessary for us to relate to the world in a better way. And I think if nature journaling is just another hobby or just another rational thing, I've been obsessed with rationality and logic, and nature journaling is really good for critical thinking, and I always push that. But I'm starting to question that more. Um, and in a lot of ways, if you think about it, nature journaling is really incompatible with indigenous ways of seeing the world. And I haven't really questioned that enough until very recently. But it's like you go somewhere in the Amazon, or you go somewhere in Australia or Papua New Guinea, or sub-Saharan Africa, or Indonesia, or the Himalayas or something, and people have a very strong worldview already, and you start teaching them, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, and how to nature journal in this very like rational way. Can we meet our who are we to know what is the right way of seeing? Like I know like John Muir Laws is so hardcore science, and like I've always been pretty much like, yes, right on. But at a certain point, it's like you're in the Amazon rainforest talking to these people, showing them nature journaling. At what point do you have to be like, okay, I'm going to like back up a little bit and accept some of what they're saying? Or are you just going to be like, no, this is 100% just like based on direct observations of what you see. There's no way that that snake can actually like kill people with its tail. Like, because I've been in places where they believe that this snake, the way that it kills people or whatever, is with its tail. And like scientifically, we know that that's not possible or whatever. But like, at what point, if they're nature journaling that and they write down their nature journal, like at what point do I go like, okay, that's fine? There's things like that are starting to be like in my mind lately.
Yes, and I think this is an interesting point, because I strongly believe that there isn't one framework or way to nature journal. And I think that observing, asking questions, these things can be important. And I also think that there are people who are focusing on the internal process. How does it make you feel? What are you experiencing? What do you know? If there are obviously other ways of knowing aside from science, how can the nature journal, how can that be incorporated into a nature journal? I really think there's danger in this idea that there's one framework, there's one set of prompts, there's one way of doing it that is the be all and end all of it.
Yeah, I know. This is the part that it's like when you suddenly realize your religion or your belief system has these cracks in it, and that's what I feel right now, because I have been a strong proponent of I notice, I wonder, reminds me of, needs to be a part of nature journaling, and just how powerful I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of is. But you know part of me has wondered recently, like, if I'm pushing this in places where people aren't really seeing the world in that way, am I just pushing, and where has this like age of reason gotten us anyways? It's like during the age of reason is when we've done the worst things ever to other humans. We've done the worst things ever to the planet, all during the age of reason. So should I be going around and forcing people to use like thinking tools that are all based on reason?
Marley, I actually listened to our previous interview in preparation for this interview, and in that conversation, you said to me something about teaching and learning, and you said that you felt like you were the student of your students, and something like you feel like in teaching you're learning, and I wonder if you're answering your own question here, in that going into these places where instead of being that guy who comes in and tells someone this is the way to do it, maybe your job from here is to be the listener, and to say, and to just sit and hear and take in what other people, different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing the world, and documenting that in your own journal, rather than saying this is how you keep a nature journal. Documenting that listening. I don't know. It just came to mind because you were talking about teaching and learning in that previous discussion.
Yeah, I do think that learning is always a two-way street, and that I think teaching is a subcategory of learning. Like learning is really what's important. And yeah, I do think listening and learning and is always the most important thing. Um, yeah, yeah. I think these are pretty new ideas and sort of
Yeah,
tender, I guess,
yeah.
to be sharing in this way. But I don't feel like I have very many answers at this point. It's a lot of, I think I still need a lot of time to kind of think about this stuff.
Yeah, I feel like our conversation's gone on a whole different track than what I thought, and maybe you're obviously opening a whole lot of new ideas, a lot of thoughts, a lot of questions about everything, and I feel privileged that you're sharing that here, and it does feel like there's some more thinking to be done.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's some things that I want to get onto. We've been chatting for a while. I've got some questions from listeners, and I want to talk about your landscape painting class. So how about I'm going to throw back at you what you did to your interviewees on the Nature Journal show. I'm going to throw some questions at you for like a bit of a quick fire round, and then we're going to talk about your
Great.
landscape painting.
Wonderful.
Okay, this is from Kim. What's a skill or technique that you'd like to learn to add to your nature journaling toolset?
I want to get better at maps.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely maps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maps are so useful, especially because you're traveling around the world, visiting all these amazing places. Maps are such a great answer. Okay, this is also from Kim, and I love this one, and it seems it's got a Marley flavor to it. Would you rather be featured in a film or a documentary film about nature journaling, or have your own few months alone to nature journal your favorite subjects?
Yeah, I saw some of these questions on your Patreon that were so good. I would definitely want the latter, to have time to just nature journal. That would be my choice for sure.
It seems like that's what you're needing, your heart and brain are needing right now, is just
Yeah,
some time to do it without having to produce anything or make anything for external
exactly.
things.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
a few more. From Jackie. Oh, so Jackie said that she's really inspired by your out of the box nature journaling on a kayak, nature journaling hanging from a rope from a helicopter. No, you didn't really do that, but I can see you doing that. And you've even inspired Jackie to get out on the kayak herself. And
Yeah.
the question is, what makes you decide on a particular crazy journaling location or activity? What's your thought process behind these things?
I think it's sort of just random, or like what a kid would do probably. But like for example, next Wednesday, the Nature Journal show is going to be how to nature journal in a pond. And so I decided that where I was living last month, there was a pond, and I wanted to experiment with more amphibious nature journaling. And so I've done from kayaks before, and I've done different amphibious ones before, but I wanted to just try to swim around and see if I could just sort of tread water in nature journal, and a couple other, and there's like lily pads and stuff. But basically, that was prompted because there was a pond where I was living. So I think it's like that, it's just opportunistic mostly.
Yeah. Whatever you see a wherever you see a barrier, maybe, or a
Yeah,
challenge.
or if there's something interesting there, because I think, there's all these places where we don't normally nature journal, like at night.
Mm.
There's tons of stuff happening at night, but like why aren't we nature journaling? Well, because we're mostly diurnal species and because of light, and it's all of these sort of arbitrary reasons, but it's 50% of nature that is not being put into people's nature journals. So that's enough reason right there to incorporate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, one more from Linda. Besides nature journaling, what other passions fill you up?
I like dancing, especially Latin dance, so salsa and bachata in
Wow.
particular. I haven't been able to practice that much, but before COVID, I was going dancing twice a week. And I do like fishing, but I haven't been doing that lately. I love just nature stuff in general, like plants and animals, using iNaturalist, for example, looking for reptiles and amphibians. Yeah, those are some of
Those are good
the main
answers.
ones I would say. Hmm.
So let's get on to. I actually asked you to come back on the show because you've produced this nature journaling course, and I would
Hmm.
love for you to give it a really good promo because I think it's fantastic. It's on Skillshare and it's all about drawing landscapes, and I'd love for you to just go all out with promoting it.
Yeah, well, I have two on there now, and so just to sort of tell the backstory, the first one I made in February. It was not that long after my birthday. I was trying to figure out more. I had recently done my taxes, so I could see like how much money I had not made in the previous year. So I was like, okay, maybe I should try Skillshare. Before I did any research or learned from people such as Alex Boone, all of these recent problems about Skillshare, before I read anything like that, I didn't really do a bunch of like research about it. I was like, okay, I know what is necessary to create the class, and I just drove to the desert, east, like sort of southeast California. I just drove to the desert, and I had, I think, a whole week. And I just camped out by myself in the desert, and I was like, I'm gonna make a video. I went through all of the mental things of like procrastination, perfectionism, all these different thoughts about how to make it, all the different things that can befall an artist or creative person when they're trying to make something that they care about. And what I ended up doing was creating a virtual nature journaling adventure. So the idea is instead of just a regular Skillshare class, it's like I filmed the whole thing as if we're on an adventure together, and like we're appreciating being outdoors, because all the Skillshare classes are in these studios with like the boring succulents and the exact same background. It's really sterile and indoor. And so that whole class, I filmed it, and edited it and published it in a really short amount of time. And I was like, this is awesome. All of these crazy things happened. It ended up getting like I did all this promotion, and then the weekend it came out, they like pulled it off, and then they made me go through this whole crazy like identity verification process that totally messed up my like promotion campaign. Long story short, then it was like a disaster. Long story short, for my next one, I got accepted into this residency program, they call it, where they provide you support to create a class. So then that was a whole nother thing on the opposite end of the spectrum. And it ended up taking, I think, 5 or 6 months to make the class, because at this point it's like when you're creating artwork but you also have like a committee of people looking at it and being like, well, could you actually change that, could you change this, could you do that, and even the title and everything, it was like it had to go through like a whole committee of people. And I was nomadic at the time, so it's like they'd be like, can you refilm this? And I'm like, no, I'm actually thousands of miles
Oh
away from
no.
where I filmed that part. Yeah, so in the end, the class is about landscape painting, and the hope was like, okay, maybe nature journaling is too specific, especially for Skillshare. If I make it about watercolor landscape painting outdoor, I can still make it fun and make it outdoors. but it can be a broader audience, and it is something that still is super important for nature journaling. I think the landscapes are, like having these little landscapes on your page, like
It
can
captures so
can
much.
make like a really big difference. Yeah, exactly. And so it's filmed on multiple continents. There's footage from all kinds of crazy places, from the Grand Canyon River, from seaside cliffs in Costa Rica and the Galapagos in California, in the desert, all these different places, and it's very practical, step by step, and I think it's fun to take it. The weird thing is it's gotten a fair amount of view hours already, but only one person has turned in a project, and I
Okay.
think this might just be something about Skillshare, but like people take classes or sign up for classes, but they sometimes even watch stuff, but they don't actually do the project. So hopefully more people will load up projects. And if you want to get like better at landscape painting, I really go in depth, and we break it down little by little, and it can definitely make your landscape painting way better.
I took the class. I haven't uploaded my project, but I'm going to do it now because you've shamed me into it.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I completely recommend it. I'm going to put some links to all these things in the show notes for this podcast. And maybe just mention a little bit more about why landscapes in particular can help you in your nature journal practice, and maybe we can relate it back to like that idea of embodying a place. I think that
Hmm.
that is really relevant here when we're talking about these deep things. I think that sitting in a landscape and taking that in, finding your place in that entirety of the landscape is important. Maybe you can riff on that a little bit.
I think it's true, and I'm glad that you made that connection, or else I would have had to try to do it. But I think it's weird because landscape painting at first glance might seem like one of the aspects of nature journaling where it's like, it seems like, oh, it's the least nature journaly, or it's like the most frivolous, or it's like people think of like plein air and Monet or something, and you have to like have some weird hat.
A beret.
um, yeah, exactly. But, as you're pointing out, I think that you have to see a whole place, and it's making you think about that relationship and just sort of even though it's aesthetic, I think aesthetics of landscapes is actually very core to how humans relate to the world um, in a very deep and even subsistence way. And so it's like when you see a landscape, it's like your body has this feeling of like, oh, I could survive here, or oh, wow, this is really crazy. Maybe this would be a place to go on like a vision quest, but I don't think I would want to live here, or like this is really intense,
Yeah.
like there's or it's very diverse, or it's very like open, or it's very closed. And so all of those things I think relate.
That's so interesting that you say that. And in fact it is a visceral experience, isn't it? You get a sense, and it's maybe this isn't the right word, but like it's an internal primal sort of thing. Like
Hmm.
this is a landscape for me, or this is foreign to me. Or I have a
Hmm.
friend who grew up in the desert, in around the deserts in Israel, and she
Hmm.
is now here and lives in a rainforest. And she told me that
Hmm.
there's this sense of claustrophobia with a canopy cover because her body is used to this open expanse of the landscape in the desert. And
Hmm.
it's interesting to hear you say that it is actually a body thing. It is an internal
Hmm.
thing. It is part of us, and maybe it is to do with the landscapes of your childhood or something like that, but
Hmm.
you do get a sense of like, this is a safe place, this is odd, this is making me feel like moving or staying still or hiding or something like that.
Yeah, and then the whole time that you're doing the landscape, I also think it's a jujitsu way of observing animals, because it's just like when you draw a tree or you draw a rock or you draw a cliff, you're sitting there with something that moves very slowly, and you have to sort of relate to that thing. But while you're doing that, it's like you're focusing all your predatory attention on that rock, or landscape, and then it's like the birds or the animals are more likely to show up, and then you can have those sort of in the marginalia and keep track of them. Don't just be like, oh, I'm only painting a landscape, because
Yes.
that really bothers me as well. I don't know how people can do that, and not have sort of like a little side area for all the other things that are happening.
Yeah, amazing. I really love your course. I recommend it to everybody who's listening. Marley, thank you so much for joining me again and for bringing up these really important points. That this wasn't how I thought our conversation was going to go, but I think it's really important, and I'm really glad this has come up, and there are things for a lot of the, as I say, the cohort of Nature Journal teachers who are coming through, like, how do we do it? Why are we doing it? What's going on here? Let's all have this like joint existential crisis and see what happens next.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm glad that we had that conversation as well.
Thanks so much, Marley. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Marley. As I said before, this was not at all the way I thought this conversation would go, but I think Marley brought up a lot of really interesting points and things that we need to think about as nature journalers. Some things that made an impression on me were when he asked, what's the magic of what we're doing? What are we calling into being by putting these marks on paper? And what role does the spiritual connection play in all of this? I think Marley's right in proposing that the individual, rational, scientific way of thinking might not be enough to enact the changes that we need to make right now in this world. And I think this conversation is a good starting place for further conversation about this point. What do you think is the best way to create this embodied connection with nature that Marley was talking about? Is nature journaling enough? Can we experience this through nature journaling alone, or do we need other ways of connecting? I know for myself that this feeling, sensing, heart-focused way of nature journaling has always been my focus. I think science is important, and I have a science degree, but for me, nature journaling has always been about this heart piece. But how do we teach that as educators? How do we guide others to let the nature journal be a place to explore nature from a deeper place, not as an observer with a notebook, but as an integrated part of it all, feeling and knowing our connection to nature? Because that connection has always been there, and it will always be there. No matter how disconnected we feel or how many hours we spend with our technology, we are nature. We are part of this, and we need to remember and feel that. I'd love to know your thoughts on all of this. You can share your experience and ideas by leaving a comment below this podcast episode on the Journaling with Nature website. If you're on the platform Skillshare, I encourage you to go check out Marley's wonderful new landscape painting class. And if you're not on the platform, you can investigate it using the link in the show notes for this episode. There's a special link there that will give you a discount if you are new to the Skillshare platform. Head over there and see what Marley's class is all about. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.